The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's managing editor, Cobus van Staden. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
And to my left, and I say that to my left, that's really exciting. I'll tell you why. Geraud, our Africa editor, as always with us.
Good afternoon, Eric. Good afternoon, Cobus.
If it sounds a little weird today, it's because for the second time in the 14 and a half years we've been doing this show, we're actually in person, recording together from Solid Gold Studios in Johannesburg. So it's nice to see you guys. We're in town for a number of conferences on China, Africa, critical minerals. We're going to talk about that in the second half of our show. We're going to do a little bit of a wrap up today on some key events that have happened this week before we get to the conferences and why we're all together here. Listen, it was an eventful week for Zambia. And then we're going to talk about some comments that Brazilian President Lula gave earlier in the week. And it was a little bit shocking, Cobus. So let's first start with what happened with Zambia. On Monday, we got word that this big debt deal that they negotiated back in June in Paris fell apart, and it really sent the kwacha crashing. The headlines were that France and China rejected the deal from the private creditors, and I'm going to put a little disclaimer before we go into this conversation. All of us who've been following this story for the past 2 years, 2.5 years really, have been struggling to figure out what's been going on, and this week is particularly difficult. A lot of the information has been coming out in bits and pieces. In fact, a lot of the news coverage was very sparse. All of the sides are not talking. Cobus, give us a little bit of an overview. You've been trying to understand what's going on in this story. Tell us a little bit about the best you can put this together.
So, as far as I understand, the issue with Zambian debt that's been going on for a long time is that they have a very complicated debt mix, and their debt to China includes both commercial and state lenders. And they have big kind of loans from private creditors that are based in the US and multilateral development banks. So, as we understand it, they had some kind of agreement with their bilateral creditors, and now recently they struck a deal with their private creditors. These are Eurobond lenders and other private creditors. Now the creditor committee from their bilateral lenders, led by France and China, have rejected the deal that they struck with the private creditors. Now they need to have all of these people on board in order to move forward with an International Monetary Fund rescue package. So that is the problem. The fact that this deal fell apart seemingly, or at least hit a road bump, means that they can't move forward with the IMF deal. And so that then raises a lot of other questions, and it strands Zambia in a situation where its currency is crashing.
And interest rates went up.
Interest rates are shooting up, and Zambia isn't sure how it's going to be keeping the lights on while all of this is being worked out.
So the reaction coming out of Paris from the Paris Club is actually quite mild. They're trying to say, hey, everybody, this isn't the end of the world. The finance ministry in Lusaka is saying something very similar, but some of the analysis that's coming out, and Joe, I want to get your take on this, is quite extreme. So there's some great analysis from Clement Graf von Luckner, who's a former economic advisor at the World Bank, and he said the official creditor committee in Zambia repeatedly rejecting private creditors' restructuring proposal signals nothing short of a paradigm shift. Now, the paradigm shift here that Clement was talking about is that in the old world, which was pre-COVID, private creditors were the senior creditors. So they got paid back first because the bilateral creditors often gave loans at concessional terms. And so they were lower down. The Chinese saying this isn't fair. And the Chinese have been insisting from the beginning, and this was the debate we had for much of this year about the insistence that multilateral development banks also take haircuts on their loans. The Chinese were saying equal treatment. And so here they are insisting that there should be equal treatment, that if the private creditors are getting a deal, the same deal should be given to bilateral creditors. Now, the bilateral creditors are, again, quiet on this. The bondholders are saying, you know what, we're not going to be told by the Chinese or any sovereign creditor what our deal is. So we've got basically a situation where the bondholders and the bilaterals have guns pointed at each other, threatening to shoot. Geraud, here we are again where Zambia seems to be the collateral damage in all of this.
Yes, you remember a few months ago we were having this discussion where we had that position where we saw China was in the middle, kind of blocking the machine from the bilateral creditors. China was presented as the one setting new conditions, new terms, and people were kind of worried about how Chinese was moving on that. I remember even Janet Yellen, when she visited Zambia, expressing how China is asking many questions. She was kind of reporting what David Malpass was saying, that China is asking many questions and China is making the whole process complex. And later on we saw China finally agreeing, kind of reluctantly, because it was worried about what's going to happen with the private bondholders. And when we see now how things are moving, people tend to say, yeah, maybe kind of China was worried about the situation with a certain reason. Now we find ourselves, as we see ourselves now, in a new position where Zambia basically is again in the middle of a fight of basically of the international financial system. Because the debate is like, how do we approach that situation right now? I remember a few weeks back when I was reading about the story, even the IMF was expressing its concern when he heard the first news about the condition with the Zambia signed with the bondholders. It was signaling that there is something that needs to be done. At that time, China was said that, we don't have the details yet, but we expect that everybody is going to be treated fairly with the context that we are having right now. And a few days later, finally, they just came out and said, we are not going to move forward with that. And again, in that context, Zambia find itself, as I said earlier, really caught in the mix in that debate where you kind of wonder who has the solution. I don't know if you remember that. In the beginning of that debate, China wanted the private, I don't know if it was China or its friends, but one of them wanted the private bondholder to be part of the discussion in the beginning, to know that we all need to know everything that's going to be done for everybody. The private bondholder refused. They say, Zambia needs to strike a deal first with the bilateral creditor and then they have to come to us. And that was, we can see clearly now they knew what they was doing. They knew that with the pressure of the IMF, the international community, the bilateral creditor are going to get the haircut that they're not going to get. And this kind of take us to the debate we've been telling for a long time, that the private bondholders, the power they do have on the international system and in the loan in Africa is just mind-boggling. And the fact that European government and Western government can really do literally nothing into forcing them to revisit their approach to those debt negotiation in Africa is a real problem. And here we find ourselves where Zambia is caught in the middle again.
Cobus, the narrative that a lot of the press is coming out with is that this is China's doing, that China gummed up the system here. We don't know that, to be sure. So I think that's very important for us to step back. We're going to have some experts coming on the show in the weeks ahead. In fact, we've spoken with Reuters correspondent Rachel Savage, who covers this story. She's agreed to come on the show and help us understand the mechanics of it. One thing, though, that we are getting a good sense of is that the common framework looks like it got a bullet in the back of its head on Monday, and that the common framework was already a frail mechanism to do these debt restructurings. Now it looks like it's just not up to the task. So the question is, if you are sitting in Ethiopia, in Ghana, and in many other countries that are counting on the common framework to help you get through these debt restructurings, what do you think they're thinking about right now?
Well, the kind of calculation that they're making probably is a new kind of take on a wider kind of logic that underlay the common framework itself, which is these attempts to try and kind of make an IMF-guided comprehensive debt restructuring still possible. The common framework was aimed at trying to facilitate that in a moment of crisis or where the number of lenders have also multiplied and the complexity of the debt mix became really, really much more complex. In this context, I think everyone is probably looking to Sri Lanka, where one of the problems in the Sri Lankan debt negotiation has been...
Which, by the way, they're not part of the common framework.
They're not part of the common framework, right. to be sure. But what we saw in, kind of, they're not part of the common framework, but they similarly as Zambia, like in a massive debt hole. But what we've seen there is that China has been doing like parallel meetings with the Sri Lankans, and then only sitting in on the bilateral creditor meetings as an observer, even though it's fully as big as it's Sri Lanka's other bilateral creditors. So there's this kind of parallel negotiations happening between China and Sri Lanka and its bilateral creditors, Sri Lanka and its market-based creditors. And I assume that's maybe going to become the new normal. I mean, like if I were in like a leader of a debt-distressed country, I'd probably be calling Beijing, like to have some kind of side conversation with them in preparation for whatever else is going to happen.
But Ghana tried it and couldn't. Ethiopia also wanted to have that same face-to-face, but it also didn't work. Beijing didn't want to go in face-to-face with them.
They tried to, yeah.
Well, China's debt in Ghana was only about $3.4 billion, very small, so I think they're concerned about setting a precedent in Ghana. Ethiopia is a different kettle of fish here, in part because they are the second largest borrower in Africa from China. 13.7 billion is what we estimate. No one really knows for sure on the outside. It's a huge amount of money. One has to think, though, Cobus, if they follow your advice and call up Beijing and say, let's sort this out, then Ethiopia can find a way out just by negotiating bilaterally with China.
If I'm correct, I think Ethiopia has already negotiated a pause in repayments.
A pause, but that's not a restructuring. That's not a full restructuring.
But then, like Beijing tends to avoid restructurings as much as they can. They prefer reschedulings, pushing it down the line, and with additional kind of liquidity lending, kind of to fill up the gaps, which is a long-winded way of saying a much bigger debt problem than like a few years down the line than you have right now.
But even with the agreement with Zambia, it's pretty much the same. When you look the details, it's not really restructuring because just like they give a long extension and they put a condition, if Zambia's economic situation recovers well, Zambia is going to have to pay back the full loan. So it's even there, you realize that it's still not a really haircut. It's just like a provisional haircut for a certain amount of time.
And that's why I said that the Zambia deal at the time back in June was debt restructuring with Chinese characteristics. Exactly. I was told by a number of people that that was not the case. No one has yet to contradict that. And the key question for me was, absent China, would that Zambian deal have looked the same? And everybody then says, no, it would have looked very different. So to me, that's China very much setting the tone. Going back to the tweet I was mentioning earlier about the paradigm shift, China is asserting itself. And I think that is the system trying to figure out what to do. China complicates this whole system, though, because never before have we had a sovereign creditor, a bilateral creditor, behave both as a concessional lender, which is traditionally what governments have done, which is these low interest, almost like aid, okay, and a commercial creditor at the same time. So China is both Goldman Sachs and like a World Bank. And the system doesn't know how to handle that. And I don't know where we go from here, I'll be honest with you.
Exactly. You even remember China wanted to be treated as the World Bank. At the beginning of this, no, because my main lenders are China Exim Bank and the China Development Bank, so I also want to be treated this way. But they found an agreement where now I'm kind of in the middle. But as you're pointing out, Eric, now they're like, okay, I have my creditors on one side. I also have this bilateral creditor to deal with. But most of the time, you mentioned that before, we tend to forget that China has itself an internal massive debt problem is local government. The way China is behaving right now, it doesn't want to set a precedent at the same time.
Geraud, I am so glad you brought that up. Cobus and I have had some conversations this week while we were in town with various stakeholders, and one of our conversations with some Chinese stakeholders mentioned the fact, and this is something you and I have been talking about for years, is that there's a lot of public pressure on the Chinese government not to cancel the debt, in part because the Chinese economy right now is not doing great. And they say, why are we cutting slack to Zambia when Zhejiang province is not allowed to restructure or cancel its debts to the central government? And so in many ways, the Chinese government has a lot of pressure in their hands tied. They have to push hard on this because they're going to get slapped by their own people. And we heard, this week in our conversations that it's a sensitive issue back in China.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also in the bigger kind of like international politics sense, it also sends quite a robust message of this is what South-South cooperation is going to look like. It's not going to be the North-South interaction that one has where, which is always happening in the context of the wider kind of unjust kind of transfer of wealth from the South to the North that preceded all of this and, that to a certain extent still continues through the kind of interactions with commercial lenders that Geraud mentioned. Kind of all of this calling on more egalitarian lending that underlies the kind of South-South cooperation. This is part of the egalitarian part of it, right? Kind of so that kind of it's got to get repaid no matter what. I think is part of the message that China is sending.
So we're going to have another show on this, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, to update everybody with someone more knowledgeable than us on this, who actually understands the technical details. Again, we're going to have Rachel Savage from Reuters to come on to talk to us and just explain it at a very high level. She's been covering this story from the beginning, so I think she can contextualize and tell us what we don't know. And there's a lot that we don't know. And so this is a very tough subject to look at. Pity the very poor people in Zambia now whose bond rates have skyrocketed. The currency has really taken a hit. Interest rates were increased on Wednesday. That means that life just got a lot harder for a lot more people.
And I don't want to be sitting with the Hakainde Hichilema right now. He has to be under lots of pressure. He promised a lot before coming into power. He really showed that he wanted to do something, but now you really have a very, very strong, difficult situation for him to deal with now.
Okay, let's move on to our second story. On Tuesday, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva said something I think that took a lot of people by surprise. He was giving the commencement address at the Brazilian Diplomatic Academy, and in a scripted speech, and let me just read a quote, and I know both of you are really excited to kind of get in on this one. Brazil, this is a quote from the Brazilian president. Brazil had to play a very strong role to not allow Africa to continue being held hostage by colonizers or by very strong interventions from China, which was seeking places to buy the food they needed so much. Okay, Geraud, let's go.
I mean, like, why? When I read the comment, I was like, why? I mean, of all the things he could have said and done, why? You look at the whole speech where he was, there was literally no need to pull a stunt like this. There's no winning into that. There's no gain into insert that sentence, that portion of his speech in there. Because he was talking about so many different topics in his speech, you know, Brazil diplomacy, how Brazil needs to move forward and everything. But then he mentioned that. And for a moment, I was like, as if someone sent a text from, I don't know, a capital from Washington or, I don't know, in London, say, let's go and poke the bear there and talk about China. It took me by surprise, and it shocked me a lot, especially when we are just like, few months away from the BRICS enlarged from South Africa. Everyone was happy, shake hand and everything, smiling, new world order, new approach, new international system. You know, we are all going the same way, finish all those debt trap narrative and all. We are all in the same page. And then who's coming? A member of the BRICS itself, the B in the BRICS, come out and say, you know, we try to protect also Africa from China. Really?
Let me give you some feedback from Samuel Beria, who's one of our friends from Tanzania at the University of Dar es Salaam, and he wrote, in response to the tweet, I reposted this circulated on Twitter, or X now. Not sure if I am appalled by the fact that someone outside of Africa is boasting about defending the interests of the continent on its own soil, or the fact that Africa is once again portrayed as a passive victim of foreign interventions. Let's go to the statement and unpack it. There's the part where he wants to protect Africa from being taken hostage by the Chinese and other foreign colonizers. And at the same time, there's a reference to food. Cobus, these are issues that we've deconstructed over the years, but tell us why the president was just so boneheaded wrong on this.
Yeah, this makes no sense. I mean, you know, kind of on the food side, like no one should know more than him that China is actually a very small importer of food from Africa. Like there's, you know, kind of agricultural imports from Africa is really negligible.
And because in part, they buy a lot from Brazil.
Yes, they buy everything from Brazil. So they don't need it from Africa because they're already buying it from Brazil.
And also because Africa is largely smallholder farms, whereas Brazil is massive industrial farms.
Yes. And we know all of that because we're obsessed and we've been following it, but also, you know, because Brazil is slowly displacing the US out of China, particularly from buying soybeans and corn. You know, so no one should know that better than him. But, you know, a lot of it just came off as just very kind of tin-eared and condescending. In the first place, I think one should be careful to not conflate what he said exactly, because he was talking about strong interventions from China and then contrasting that to, or like putting it next to the colonizers, right? So he's not actively calling China a colonizer, but he is also putting them together in a category.
Colonizer adjacent.
Yes. But then at the same time, what also baffled me about it was that he's now positioning Brazil as this actor that should be moving into the space. But I mean, Brazil-Africa relations has a long history. Like, Brazil has been an active player in parts of Africa for a long time. If he wanted to announce a more energized engagement from Brazil in Africa, which would, I think, be very welcome, then there could have been a lot less kind of dunderheaded ways of doing that, right? Kind of like he could have featured that as like, you know what, we're moving into Africa, like we're engaging.
But consider the venue that he gave this speech.
Exactly. Yeah.
To newly graduated Brazilian diplomats. And what he's doing is he's again setting this very paternalistic, infantilizing Africa in many respects. As we heard from the University of Dar es Salaam, this is, someone and something that needs to be protected.
Exactly. As a kid that, big powers are fighting and me, Brazil, I'm coming as the one to protect you, to guide you, to protect you from the big China who's trying to take over and everything. That's even ridiculous. The other ridiculous part is the fact that, let's face it, when Lula came back in power, recently came back in power, he was basically absent in everything Brazil-Africa related for the last at least 8 years when he was in prison and he was basically absent in that space there. So when he mentioned that, I really wonder, what is he referring to? Because when Jair Bolsonaro was in power, Brazil was absent, was away from Africa. So when he was making that reference, I was like, where are you coming from? What are the elements you are basing your statement to? And as you say, talking to diplomat is basically setting their mind into the perspective that when we're going to send you in Africa, you have to go to behave as if, we are the hero. We are the one we are going to, protect them. And that's really condescending. It's insulting. And I'm quite surprised that China so far kept quiet.
Yeah, well, it hasn't gotten a lot of feedback. No one really saw it other than nerds like us. But it's something we'll keep an eye on. But I think it's just interesting to kind of talk about another player, particularly one who is a founding member of the BRICS.
But Eric, do you see that there's cracks into the BRICS?
No. I don't know if we can go that far. The giant gaping hole in the BRICS is between India and China. My guess is that China, the ambassador in Brasilia, probably called up and said, what the F are you doing? I mean, like what? Really? And I think that was more. I think this is probably a one-off, is my guess.
Let's hope so.
Well, the reason why we're all here together, and this is, again, in the 14 years we've done the show, only the second time we've actually been in a room together to record the show, first time that we've done it with our good friend Geraud, is because all week there have been a series of conferences at Wits University about China-Africa relations, journalism, critical minerals. And it's been just an amazing week of meeting just actually hundreds. This is the largest AIJC, the African Investigative Journalism Conference. I think 347 journalists. It's the largest conference that takes place of its kind anywhere in Africa. We've been a part of this for the past 5 years, and we're thrilled to be back again. And we are just absolutely delighted to have one of the organizers of the conference and our partner in this whole endeavor. At the beginning of the show, you hear that little ad for the Africa-China Reporting Project. The woman behind the Africa-China Reporting Project is Bongiwe Tutu, who is the project coordinator for ACRP. Thank you so much for joining us today, and congratulations on just an amazing week of conferences.
Thank you so much, Eric.
Well, let's talk about the different events that took place, and let's start in the beginning of the week, and we'll get to the end of the week. In the beginning of the week was the African Investigative Journalism Conference. Lots of discussions about China. Tell us a little bit about what happened and what were some of the themes and what were some of your takeaways from the AIJC.
Such an honor to be with you guys. I've never been in a podcast before, so
You're doing great so far.
Thank you. So our first convening was within the AIJC, the African Investigative Journalism Conference. And this was the 19th conference being hosted by Wits University since 2004. So it was quite a large gathering of journalists, of media professionals, experts and researchers from across the continent and around the world. And the Africa-China Reporting Project facilitated 2 sessions within that conference. And we saw that on the first day of the conference, on the Monday, the 20th, where we had a session on amplifying African voices in climate change, as well as a session on improving China literacy, a workshop that we held specifically for African journalists.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about that second workshop. That was actually moderated by Geraud. And so talk to us a little bit about this idea of China literacy and African journalists, and what was the discussion that you had, the various attendees there?
It was really interesting. I really loved that because it was a session where we were trying to bring basically bringing a China 101 to African journalists. in our discussion, in our private discussion here in CGSP, we keep on saying and complaining how much when you read the coverage of China issues in Africa, there's no much depth into it. We feel a lot of lack of information, nuances. So that workshop was aiming to African journalists to help them acquire the tool to first understand China.
Okay, so give us some of the practical tips that you convey to some of the journalists in terms of how they can improve their coverage of China or of Africa-China relations.
We've covered the difficulties, for instance. One of the major difficulties was language barrier, how much it was difficult to get access to Chinese information, because a lot of good Chinese informations are in Chinese, and when you don't speak Chinese, you have that problem. We mentioned the fact that they don't always have the profile, the people, the expertise that's required in the newsroom, because you have a huge amount of human resources, students coming from China who lived in China, who had experience in China, but somehow you don't find them not only in politics, but you also don't find them in media. So you can feel it in the coverage they're doing about Chinese issues in Africa. And one of the tips we give them, like, we encourage them first to hire much more Africa alumni from China to be part of the discussion. We also mentioned the fact that necessity for them to, visit China, to know more about China, because it's something to report about China in Africa when you've never been to China, because it's really hard to get China from far. And many of them, they've never been to China. And those who've been to China, they've been to those junket trips to China. But most of them, they came back fascinating without the critical mindset. We did encourage them to go to China, but really to keep a clear mind, a clear understanding of how things are happening there. So yes, it was really, we gave them a lot of tips, developing Chinese sources, getting to know Chinese. And one of the issues they raised is the fact that Chinese don't talk. Chinese officials don't talk to people. How do you come to create access with Chinese officials? How do you come to create that relation? And we showed them that it's very important as journalists to become relational people, to take the time to build personal relationship with Chinese diplomats in post, in Chinese companies, because along the years, they're going to start to develop sources, because we see that with Western media and journalists post in Africa, they have a long extended relationship with politicians and everything. This is the thing that many African journalists do not do with Chinese diplomats. And I think the language barrier is one of the factors that maybe they're afraid to do such, but it really encourages them to build those networks to be able to build the resources they need.
So, Bongiwe, we also participated in a panel that was focusing on elevating African voices in relation to climate change. And Africa-China Reporting Project has, for a long time, for years now, been elevating African voices in relation to many issues in relation to China, but also a lot of them ecological and environmental. So I was wondering what your kind of takeaways were, kind of from that conversation and, kind of how it feeds into the work that Africa-China Reporting Project does.
So I think what was the most important takeaway from that discussion is the fact that African voices are taken apart from that discussion of climate change as it impacts the continent. Discussions about what kind of solutions should be adopted are held from the global north, and the global south community is still left behind or outside of those decisions that are made. And so that was the most important takeaway from that discussion. And it kind of puts out the need for us to keep on supporting and building the capacity of African journalists so that they are able to unpack and understand these discussions around climate, around the energy and the just transitions. Because in as much as we need to be a part of these kinds of engagements and these problem-solving discussions, we still find that a lot of journalists lack the adequate skills. They still lack the knowledge, and they still lack the resources and the information to be able to put out quality reporting on these issues. And that's very important in order to drive this understanding of the impact of the climate change and the resolutions that are required. So I think that's one of the important points that came from that.
What took me by surprise was in previous years, the AIJC events and the Africa-China reporting events were largely Anglophone events. And that's not surprising because we're here in South Africa. This year, though, very different. A very strong Francophone presence at the conference and in the attendees, and even at ACRP's, their events and in the funding that you're doing. Talk to us a little bit more about this idea of moving beyond the Anglophone discourse and into the Francophone conversation.
So that's quite important, and it's an approach that journalism is swifting into. And the Africa-China Reporting Project in the most recent years has moved to quite a number of Francophone journalists into our initiatives and training workshops. And as well as we saw from the AIJC, having the Francophone community of journalists participating as well, giving their presentations in French and having that translation interpretation option available. It's to recognize that there has been too much of a focus within the Anglophone speaking media for the past, number of years, neglecting the Francophone community, especially the Francophone media spaces. And that is neglecting a whole pool of a population that's...
Yeah, no, I get where you're coming from. No, that's okay. But Geraud, the issue here that you had the chance to see a lot of the journalist work that was presented. What's the difference in the Anglophone and the Francophone discourse, as you heard it this week, about China from all these different journalists from different Francophone countries across Africa?
I was really impressed, though. I was really impressed by the, I wouldn't say discrepancies, but the huge difference between Francophone Africa and Anglophone Africa in terms of newsroom. We had this huge Kenyan delegation. And you saw when they were talking about media and coverage about different issues, China or any other issue, you can see a much more strong newsroom from Anglophone Africa. But when you go in Francophone Africa, you had the feeling that there was a lot of lack. There was a lot of not as much as structuration, not as much as strength in terms of how they structured the newsroom, in terms of the teams and everything. And it was kind of, I don't know if it was a reflection of the economic differences about Anglophone Africa and Francophone Africa, but you could see that. That was something was it really struck me by surprise. And mind you, I'm coming from in Francophone Africa, I was like, wow. Because I've never been in contact with newsroom in Anglophone Africa. When I saw that, I was the team, they came there, the way they're talking about the topic and the subject, the work they've done, the tremendous work they've done, you could see the huge difference. And I say there is something that needs to be done a lot in Francophone Africa. I think that newsroom needs to be strengthened financially. We even talked about the economic model of the medias in Africa, and especially in Francophone Africa. What's the future of media? How they're going to organize themselves to really be able to build something really strong in that space.
Well, we brought a lot of reading materials that we've produced on various reporting guides, and we brought a lot of them in Arabic, and there were none were picked. So I'm hoping that next year that they improve to include the North African countries into this discussion as well. So that's my hope. But there's been a lot of progress this year.
We had one Arabic, though. We had a journalist from Tunisia.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I hope she got some material to go with.
But the end of the week, ACRP partnered with China Dialogue to run a seminar and a training session on reporting on critical minerals. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, so towards the end of the week, we held a training workshop with China Dialogue Trust, and that is on critical minerals for the energy transition. And we've been seeing numerous media reports covering what are critical minerals, covering the issues of lithium and production that comes from the natural resources. And so the issue there is that in as much as this topic is very prominent and of importance, there are still missing links and there are still gaps in the reporting, and many journalists don't have the understanding of how to report on critical minerals. And so the workshop was to provide some expertise. We had some experts coming from various countries in the African continent, as well as outside of the continent. We had experts coming from Kenya, from Malawi, Indonesia, and as well as the UK. We had experts coming from China as well, and some from Hong Kong. And we had some participants, journalists who were awarded reporting grants to go and investigate issues around this topic. And journalists were coming from countries such as Zimbabwe, Malawi, Mozambique, Uganda, and some participants who joined us from South Africa. And so the program was quite rich and informative to sort of provide the guidance and support for journalists. And we find that there is still an understanding of what exactly is a critical mineral. How does it become defined as a critical mineral? And what are the implications thereafter once it has been defined as a critical mineral in terms of how it is used. So those are the kind of engagements that we had. We had a number of experts as well from Wits University. From the Wits Mining Institute, we had Dr. Nelson Chipamangate, who was defining, explaining, breaking down exactly what are critical minerals. And that was quite a good foundation for the journalists, because from that session, a lot of them reflected on how much knowledge that they've now received as a result of that session. We also had a number of experts as well. Dr. Wei Xin from the Institute of Development Studies, who spoke as the keynote, introducing the fundamental understandings of critical minerals and as well as the energy transition. Geraud was also presenting at the workshop. So it was quite impactful. And the second day also consisted of a number of sessions and experts. We had journalists as well reflecting on their practical experiences. How do they go about on the field when conducting these investigations? We heard on some do's and don'ts in reporting on critical minerals. And so I think it really was something that is necessary and is bridging the gap of the importance in understanding these issues and having them being published in a more informative kind of way to inform society and the community members exactly how to make sense of this issue.
Cobus, you were participating in a lot of these discussions, and I kept thinking to myself, if this event was held in London or in Washington or in Los Angeles, the topic of critical minerals would have been only about China. And what we heard from a lot of the journalists, though, was concerns about their own government and the enforcement of their own government's rules, regulations, corruption, dangers of reporting on these issues, that there's a real risk to life in reporting on some of these issues. Talk to us about the concerns that you heard from the journalists about reporting on sensitive mining issues in Southern Africa and across the continent. And there was real anxiety in many cases.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you say, when you listen to this conversation in the global north, and this has been my experience actually in being in Europe over the last few months, it's been like the conversation there is not only about China, but it's also about just supply chains. Like how to de-China European supply chains, for example, or just how to strengthen European supply chains. No people involved, just supply chains. So, so in that sense, I think, the conversation in Johannesburg, I think really brought the human dimension home and made very clear that reporting on these issues can be quite hazardous. So there were a lot of kind of discussions on how to stay safe, how to work with affected communities who are frequently facing both pollution pressures from the mining operations and kind of semi-military pressures from the police, and then also how to actually deal with the companies involved, which are themselves highly complex transnational operations and very, very well protected. So I think part of this work that Bongiwe was mentioning was in getting people's heads around what critical minerals are and how to think about them is part of the process of Africa also setting agendas for how they'd like to deal with all of this critical mineral wealth and how to actually, kind of benefit from it actually, rather than just being another site of extraction.
It really is amazing work that you guys are supporting, underreported stories, amplifying voices, both in the climate but also in the Africa-China reporting space. Bongiwe Tutu is the project coordinator for the Africa-China Reporting Project. She is exhausted from organizing 3 events this week, but was so kind to stop by the studio to join us today. So thank you so much. If people want to find out about all the great work that you guys are doing, what are the dots and W's?
Okay, so we are at africachinareporting.com as well as africachinatraining.com. So those are the 2 main websites, as well available on Twitter or X and Facebook at Africa China Reporting Project.
And very quickly, if African journalists are listening to this and want to apply for a grant, can they still do that?
Of course, yes. We have an open call throughout the year outside of our themed grants that we provide. So we're always open to receive reporting proposals for journalists and researchers.
Fantastic. I highly recommend everybody to go check out the website because you put all the stories up there that they do. So it's just a great resource for all these stories. Just very quickly before we go, let's get a little plug for the great work that you're doing, Geraud. over at Afrique Chine on X and Projet Afrique Chine online. Tell everybody about what you're doing in our French space.
People will be really mad at me for this week since I was really, really busy with the AIJC.
Not enough updates.
Not enough updates. But guys, we are back in business. We're going to keep on covering China in Africa in French. And we made a lot of contacts over this conference. You're going to see much of our work disseminated all over the continent with different newspapers. We really hope you're going to like it. So in Projet Afrique Chine, as it called in French, you're going to find everything that we cover about China in Africa in French, allowing people to have the space to be still talking about China in Africa. We have podcasts where we have experts talking about China in Africa in French, and I here call again all those experts, professors, researchers, NGOs who are writing and calling and working on different China-related issues, even the very small, tiny issues on every day where you see China impacting your community, impacting your life or in a certain way. You want to come, just contact us in X, Afrique Chine, Afrique with a K, Afrique Chine. We're going to be happy to have you on the podcast. And my X handle, Twitter handle, Christian Geraud. In one word, Christian Geraud, Geraud, G-E-R-A-U-D. And you're going to be able to touch base with me.
And of course, if you want to follow all the great work that Cobus and the team around the world in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East are doing, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. Your subscriptions help keep this independent media project going. It's very difficult in this day and age to have these independent voices. Cobus, I was talking to you today. There was a tweet that went out, or I guess they're calling them post now.
Yeah.
There was a post that went out just today of an AI-generated image of what was supposed to be a Chinese phone factory in Zambia. And it was making the rounds on the internet as if it was real. And this is the world that we're in now. So this is why actual human beings making journalism who have a lot of experience and know the subject material is really important. So,
but Eric, I think we're going to talk about for the next podcast the work that we've done during the SCRP about the AI generated, the AI news in the space. We talked about that.
Yeah, we talked about it.
I think we ought to give the audience a bit of the piece of what's happened, what they should be looking at, and to allow them to be able to understand everything that's happening to the space. And let's don't forget, next week we are back with China CGSP Round.
We'll be back with the China Roundtable. I just also want to make sure before we leave that the great work that Bongiwe was doing at the Africa-China Journalist Forum as well, that was one of the events that took place this week. Again, just bringing together journalists from across the continent to talk about reporting on China-Africa. And it's just such a different conversation, Cobus, that we have here talking about these issues than we would, say, in Berlin or in Washington. And so the Africa-China Journalist Forum was just a fantastic event. So congratulations again to Bongiwe and the rest of the team. Let's leave our conversation there. I'll be back in Saigon next week. It was such a thrill to be in the studio together with everybody. Hopefully it won't take another year before this happens, but it's always fun when we're getting together. So once again, for Cobus, Geraud, and Bongiwe, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and Afrique Chine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.